Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Mukwebo, and I'll be facilitating tonight's hybrid launch. Maybe I should start by speaking about how I got to facilitate. So I am the founder and curator of the Book Stokvel. The Book Stokvel is a collective of readers and writers of African writings, not necessarily literature, but any type of writings. And the reason we came together, or the reason the Book Stokvel was formed, is because there's been a lack of support for Black authors, and there's also been issues of access for Black readers as well. So how we operate is that we operate as a typical Stokvel, as you know, as our parents have done, as our grandparents have done, where we come together every month to contribute money, and then we draw up a list of books that we'll be buying, which we then share amongst ourselves. So we also buy strictly from Black-owned bookstores or from Black-owned suppliers. And then we then share the books amongst ourselves for keeps as the members of the Book Stokvel. We are having our hybrid book launch at Book Circlecapital in Melville, and it's a Black-owned bookshop with quite an impressive collection of African writings. And also children's books as well. I think it's very important to emphasize that. And the owner of the store is Wela, or the co-owner rather is Wela Langeni. On my right, I have Basani Baloyi Ayabonga Cawe, who is the author of The Economy on Your Doorstep. So this is the book we are launching today. Before perhaps we get started, discussing the book at length, may you please share with us why you decided to write the book?
So I always wanted to write a book. I just never knew what I'd write it on. I think there's quite a few things that were interesting enough to write a book on, but I think this one sprang up on me when a publisher approached me and they said, "We're really interested in getting a book, from you. And if you were to write a book, what would it be on?" And I think for me, it really that was the first challenge. So I took probably a month just after that discussion, trying to think about what do I write about. And I think for me, the starting point was I had to write a book that recognizes that part of resolving the economic puzzle in South Africa has to start in the homelands. And those are the most underdeveloped or least developed parts of our country. But they are also in many ways a critical interface point with what happens on the urban periphery. So you can't explain, for instance, what happens in the townships of the Western Cape without linking it to what happens in the townships of the former, or I guess in the villages of the former Transkei or the Ciskei, because that is the nature of internal migration. And so that had to be the starting point. But I also think the second part of it had to be, how do I make a contribution to economic inquiry that is very particular about the places I know that I've come from? And I think that's why this book starts with a Black woman being shot. I know very few economic books that start from that perspective. And my idea was that economics shouldn't be just this island of inquiry that is so closed out to the reality that people are experiencing, either through dense mathematics, jargon, concepts that tend to spook all of us out. And yet these are things we interact with every single day. So for me, that was the motivation of writing the book. I needed to reflect in my own economic inquiry and in my own research interests. And first explain and try and make sense to myself of the places that I came from. Because I don't think the schooling system did that job. I don't think, to be fair, Basani, that, my studies at Wits did that job, maybe outside of the postgraduate work that I did. So, and I think in the forward of the book, I speak about it, that I had to be quite intentional about connecting the dots. I had to understand, that a place like Esbeleni, where I spent the first few years of my life, had a particular role in the broader industrial plans of the apartheid government and many of the homeland governments. And I think if we accept that as our starting point, then the book really goes into a lot of contemporary themes that also accept that that was by design. It wasn't by some divine intervention. It wasn't because, God ordained that the underdevelopment of many of the former TBVC states happened, but it was intentional design to make sure that you repress the reservation wages of African people, you close out the possibilities that people can have to survive outside of waged employment. And I think we're reaching a crisis point now where you know, the outcome of that is so difficult because you're now in an economy where capital doesn't need to employ people anymore. And yet you've designed your entire society around closing off possibilities for people to survive outside of wage work. But the wage work is nowhere to be found.
Okay, thank you for that, Aya. So the description of the book states that economies are supposed to be about people, about what they produce, what they exchange amongst themselves, what they can distribute, what they can consume, and also going back again to exchanging amongst themselves as a community, as well as with other communities. Unfortunately, we can't necessarily say the same about our country's economy. So you find yourself as a person where you produce something that you will not be able to afford to consume, or you consume something that actually takes away from local development because it was produced somewhere else. And in Aya's book, according to my beliefs and perhaps the understanding of it, is that it seeks to come up with ways and contribute to solutions as to how do we then make the economy in South Africa to be more inclusive, to also belong to the people that work it, because the truth of the matter is that an economy can never exist without people that work it. It's unfortunate that it's the people that also then don't benefit, and we need to start changing that. So I will bring in Basani, where I'd like you to share with us what your thoughts are, and perhaps even your convictions about the book, as well as about the landscape within which we exist in as a country.
So first of all, thanks for the invitation. I really needed to read this book because I loved it because of how, you know, what I was talking about, that the economy on your doorstep works on two fronts. The first is how accessible the book is, right? So he did something that economists don't do, the kind of thing that anthropologists do, to put the I at the center. This is me, this is who I am. I'm going to not make this some kind of like model or science that is removed from the social reality, and I'll place myself as part of this reality to try to explain what I'm saying. So I enjoy that. And then the economy on your doorstep, for me, intersects the economic reproduction. So what we understand as the world of work with the household, what happens there, and also what happens in our communities, and how those two things interlink. And again, many economic books don't do that, right? They are at the margins when they do. They're seen as feminists, and they're not really at the center. Whether that be the more politically conscious, heterodox type of schools, or the more mainstream. So I love the fact that he was able to do that in this book. And so I share the sentiment where he starts, the opening scene is of Maggie Jobek, right, who is a local from Malusi. Lungisi. Sorry, I'm saying that wrong. Who is walking from home from a funeral and gets shot by the army police outside of a church in Lungisi township, where a meeting about community grievances is taking place. And her cry when she awakes from a coma in the hospital was that she threw a stone at a hippo, right? Now, Cawe uses this case to put into focus how the realm of social reproduction, right? Meaning, you know, how the various activities, whether it be sexual in terms of the birth of children, or in terms of the rearing and the care for people in our society that are then made ready for work, how that realm is exploited by the capitalist class as a site for extraction. right? We often just think about the workplace and how that is a site of extraction, and we never connect it to the realm of the household and communities as well. So I was most impressed by the strategies and tactics employed by the community activists to activate social change in their fight against evictions, logger permits, and for education, sports facilities, modern water and sanitation. The withdrawal of their buying power or the consumer boycott of shops owned by whites is a powerful way of showcasing just how dependent the privileged are on the rest without bearing the cost of their dependence. And therefore, in spite of the institutions that maintain their privilege, in spite of the violence that supports them, they remain vulnerable because of that dependence, right? And I hear in Aya's books, a question on whether or not this strategy can be deployed today, right? And I think he says it can, but where it is frequently deployed is by the working class, who seem to have no option, right? However, what makes it difficult to deploy, and even there's a question mark, but however, what makes it difficult to deploy is that in a country such as ours, with a history of deprivation, designer labels and other types of consumption become, as what he quotes, honorific placeholders for wealth, right? And value, and are an exercise of citizenship. Therefore, freedom from apartheid has also meant freedom to pursue different consumption paths, end quote. The implication here is that in the pursuit of keeping up with the sitoles, it has made us vulnerable to being lured in the speculative activities of financial markets, right? Through what is called financialization, which opens us up to heaps of debt just to afford our lifestyles. Instead of questioning the products we are sold, whether or not they're affordable and whether they are necessary, we are lured by our access to retail credit. And Aya points to how these speculators have figured out that instead of investing in productive activities that create wage employment, that would result in the creation of jobs and income, so that they can make, instead of all of this, these speculators have figured out that they can disinvest in productive activities. So they figured out that they can have this investment boycott that would otherwise employ people and they extend credit to the households to buy from places like Lewis and other retail stores, or to pay for private schools instead of demanding for public schools that public schools that would allow for greater access, or quality public schools that would allow for greater access. We'll use it for medical bills, right? Private medical bills and other social reproductive activities as a stopgap in the face of low incomes, wages, high unemployment, and the reliance on grant and depressing wages. In other words, as he says, credit plays a role in mitigating the discontinuities between production and consumption, so that you can have low investment and high consumption at the same time, right? So I would like to make 2 points on the picture that I've painted thus far, which is basically drawn from the book. The first area is on the role of the history of deprivation as an explanation of this hook, right? And then the second is on how we conceptualize financialization, which allows for financial markets, this kind of financial market speculation. The second will be a bit technical, but please bear with me, right? So the first area of my reflection is that we need to broaden our understanding of consumption as a system. Indeed, context matters. Our context is a history of deprivation that has meant that freedom comes from consumption, as you argue, particularly of higher end goods and services. Therefore, deprivation is the original sin within our context that links consumption with the expression of wealth and status. While this is true, we also observe patterns of consumption, particularly of luxury goods, amongst groups who have historically enjoyed relative abundance, right, in material terms. And that is white men and white women. Therefore, what is actually going on? Yeah. And you will not find the answer to this by reading neoclassical theories of consumer choice. Here, the consumer's choice is an outcome of what they call consumer sovereignty. And this means that consumers have agency over their decision-making, such that the market mechanism, right, so supply and demand, where those two meet, is an expression of their free will, right? So consumer choice is an expression of free will. However, we know that not to be true in the real world, as consumers are vulnerable to being influenced through billions of rands that are spent in advertising, right? So there's something that intervenes there. Now, there are approaches that have been developed to understand this consumption system, and the system of provision approach is one such, right? That is part of the tradition of understanding accumulation in our society, which is a capitalist society. Crucially, and perhaps its novelty, is that it frames how consumption is to be understood in relation to its attachment to production. So, right? And consumption patterns are traced to practices, also history, but also the relations that are reproduced within the system. Therefore, within a system of provision, each group of commodities is materially produced and has its cultural significance, right? So that the idea that if I consume, so the idea that if I am, that I am for I consume is determined in activities that comprise the production of that good, its circulation, its distribution, and its consumption. And in each of those activities I've just laid out is a cultural significance that is produced, right? This will be clearer. So consumption norms and demands are not only shaped by history. History is crucial, but are also shaped by the activities that link production to consumption along this whole chain. So let's take the automotive industry, and I take that because this is key to this book, right, as an example. And here I draw from the work of Mattioli and Roberts and their colleagues, who use this approach to unpack why it is we depend so much on private cars, right? And why it would be difficult to move to low emission public transport. And of course, the move to affordable, accessible, quality public transport, which is not only used by the working class, but also the middle class. As has been shown, like if you have middle classes using the public, right, somehow that infrastructure is maintained so that it's not just the working class. That happens with the NHS. So that is a crucial thing, because in the end of the book, you talk about why is it that we're not getting this cross-class kind of solidarity, right? So anyway, so they talk about this, thinking about private car dependence. And there are 5 features of the automotive industry that explain how production impacts consumption and how these two are interlinked, right? First is the scale and the economic significance of the sector in economic development, right? and which you mention in the book. So the car market is dominated by relatively few large global multi-brand conglomerates. Historically, the car manufacturing has played an important role in economic development of early industrializing countries, because the kind of like productivity, technological enhancements that it introduced ended up being taken by other sectors as well. So, right, so its innovation has an impact across other sectors. And so that's its significance, and yeah, so that's one, right? Secondly, the sector is highly capital intensive, meaning that it tends to employ more machinery than labor, and has large economies of scale, right? Which has meant that there are very few companies in that sector. So if you want to be a car manufacturer and compete with the big guys, you will need to have a lot of capital to do so, right? Which is seen as a barrier to entry, right? This also means that it has become too big to fail, such that it has a lot of political clout because it employs a lot of people and generates a lot of tax revenue. So if there's a crisis in car sales, right? If there's a crisis and car sales will go down, then the state will step in to manage that crisis, right? And this makes sense from our perspective, like industrial, like the car industry was the only one of few industries when we liberalized that had support. We saw that in the States after the global financial crisis. Thirdly, large economies of scale mean that high levels of production are required in order to recoup the capital costs. Therefore, the sector is vulnerable to productivity constraints that emerge from times when there is overproduction. So one strategy to meet this challenge, other than financialization, which is key, right, which is what we talk about here, is to fake product differentiation, to fake the fact that these, like a BMW, different types of models are completely different, by pouring billions into marketing. So product differentiation is faked by producing general purpose designs that are structurally not different, but appeal to a broad range of consumers, and then putting superficial differences that are more aesthetic to suit different groups. And these superficial differences are at the heart of marketing campaigns that generate a false sense of lack, that trick the minds of many to purchase and hide the fact that diversity has actually been reduced. Fourth, the provision of car infrastructure, example, publicly funded road networks, the expansion of road networks, paving, and also the and no taxes on the use of car infrastructure that supports the dominance of private cars over other means of transport. And finally, private car use has gone hand in hand with land use patterns that create car dependence, right? And low density settlements, right? So we basically do not design our suburbs or towns in a way that are hospitable to public transport, right? We design them in a way that are more aligned to the use of private cars, right? So, and this is key to urban sprawl, which we suffer from a lot here. So these were often supported by incentives such as tax credit to support suburbanization. So what this analysis demonstrates is how we are all implicated here, how the state, workers, factory owners, consumers, advertising gurus. Therefore, it demonstrates the level of deep transformation that would be necessary in order to deploy cross-class consumer boycotts that, for instance, would result in the diversification of the Eastern Cape's economic base, right? This kind of analysis we don't see enough of, right? And therefore, what are then the strategies within that context, right? I'm happy to stay. I don't know if, am I taking too long? I'm happy to go on. Or do you want to?
No, I mean, I think you're giving me quite a bit to think about. Because I think one of the things that you're raising is that consumption, and you probably put it better than I do in the book, is socially and historically contingent. So, and even its links to production are also determined by the social context. So this idea in economics that, you know, economics is something where you don't need value judgments. Right. You start off on the same, you know, note, and I think even the Marxist tradition suffers from the same failure of assuming that as economic agents, we come in with some freedom to choose whether or not we'll hand over our labor power or not. Yeah. And I think the comment you're making is that even how we design suburbs, even how we design our spaces, is in response to some of those sectors. And I think what I would only add there is even how we design the townships and the villages that we have has always been on the assumption that African people would have a particular type of consumption basket. So if you look at the streets in a township, they never had in mind that you would have the number of people now who have motorized transport in a township. If you go to the villages, and I try and make an example in the book, all of the roads lead outwards to the main road that takes out labor and takes out value. But there's really no, links, be it communications, roads, or anything like that, between one village and the other. So, and the whole idea behind that is that those villages were never meant to exist for themselves. They were meant to exist for another capitalist system. And Governor Mbeki, in a comment, or in a quote I mentioned in the book, makes a very interesting example, as you say, of the former homelands and those industrial parks in Butterworth, places like Garankuwa and others, that the design of those places was never about really contesting the apartheid basis of the economy or the colonial basis of the economy. So you were trying to industrialize, but not putting in what economists call the overhead capital. So the roads, telecommunications, all of that stuff. And it was really about entrenching the cheap labor basis of the economy and trying to do maybe what some of the East Asian countries have done, which is cost leadership on the basis of low starvation wages, without really doing anything in the ambit of the home. And I think for me, this book was really about how do I link what's happening on the shop floor with what's happening at a household level, and then tie that back to systemic questions of policy. Because sometimes when we have these discussions, it sometimes feels like we can't do anything. And I think for me, we're not powerless in these debates if we know where to start and how to connect what's happening in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our spaces with what's happening at a broader policy level.
I'd like us to just backtrack a bit, Aya, and I want to use Soweto as a case study. Sure. And I want to touch on a number of things that Basani's input touched on. So I want us to look at a typical family in Soweto, and I want us to tie their current, they reside in Soweto, they have what is called backyarding, where there are people that are renting from them. They're not paying electricity because of, I don't know if I should call it indoctrination owing to the boycotts that happened in the 80s, against services.
And our promises.
Agreed, yes. Remember, free education, free water, free electricity. Actually, yes. So I just want you to now look at that household in Soweto right now in 2021. And I want you to now tie it back to the history that we have. Or the history that we come from as a country, because there often is that challenge that people are often unable to connect their present conditions, to the past. And the reason I'm also saying this is I think probably a month ago or so, when the new mayor of Johannesburg was inaugurated, a lot of people brought up the fact that it's a child of migrants. I'm like, it's the city of gold. It was built by migrants. So what do you expect? we are bound to have a mayor who's a child of a migrant, and probably soon the premier will be a child of a migrant as well. So people are unable to make that connection that actually, man, you know, the Stimela song, like you Masikela, was speaking about people like Jolie's dads, you know, us and all those kinds of things, because we also tend to want to differentiate between what we consider external migration and internal migration. So I just want to, in essence, just backtrack and just say, here's a household in Soweto right now. They don't pay electricity also because of the promises as well as the consumer boycotts that happened in the 80s. And how does that then tie to the history of the country and how they are excluded from the economy?
That's a fascinating question. And I say it's fascinating, Sarah, because in a way it teases out what I'm trying to present in the book as tools to analyze the economy on your doorstep. So I've used this book to analyze the economy I know of places that I know. And I like that you mentioned Soweto because, you know, for me, my analysis of Soweto doesn't start when Soweto emerges or where Sofasonke Mbanza, you know, the guy known as Makwande, you know, so Orlando Pirates people speak about Isga Makwande, that was a person.
I don't know.
That was a guy. There was somebody. I'm also a Chiefs fan, but I must put that out there. And the emergence of Orlando as a place, I think, is central to your question. But before we even get there, we have to start at what is South Africa? Because this migrant question emerges because there are people who think by virtue of you being born outside of South Africa, there's a certain immutability that you don't have right of claim to South Africa. And I often argue that South Africa is not even 200 years old as a phenomenon. Before 1910, there is no South Africa. There is different, what I would call fiefdoms. The Buddha are doing their own thing. We are doing our own thing. Yes, the space is contested.
I mean, even before 94, we had your Transvaal, your whatever, and now we say in Gauteng. But my mom, when she was born, it was not called that. You know,
she was born in Northern Transvaal.
How fickle, yes, it is when we deal with borders.
So these categories that we defend with our lives are very new and they are changeable. They're not immutable. So that's the first point I want to make. And when I come back to Sofasonke Mbanza, all of the development we've seen in our society, and you think about even informal settlements that are still seen as informal, but they've been around for 30 years, right? Development always follows what people are already doing. So Sofasonke Mbanza takes Orlando. He goes, he cuts up that land and he gives it for people to live. Now, only then do apartheid planners follow up and say, now this is the Southwestern Township, and they then create that space. And that happens across time. It is happening now as we speak in South Africa. So in a sense, that household that is in Orlando West, that, as you say, is not paying electricity, is a multi-generational household. Let's start there. And in the book, my starting point in the analysis is, what does that household consume, right? Once we answer that, we then get to the question, what funds that consumption? And I would argue that in our context, a big part of what funds that consumption in Gauteng is a combination of grants and wage income. So it's a combination of the working poor and people who are recipients of grants that are funding consumption in that household. But if we ask a deeper question, which is, where is that consumption produced? Then things become a bit more complicated. Because what we're realizing is that there are such long value chains in South Africa that you are highly unlikely this evening to be consuming something that has been made within a 100-kilometer radius of where we are. What that suggests is that people are heavily reliant on access to cash in order to survive, even in a context where there are resources that allow us, be it space or even skill or anything like that, to be able to produce for ourselves. Because you can produce as much as you want, but if from a cost perspective you can't compete with a Shoprite, then it just doesn't make sense. And I think for me, if I start at the household and then go to the level of the street and the community itself, one of the things that become very apparent in Soweto is the size of the streets outside of the main high streets. So Elias Mutwaledi, as you come into the township, is much larger in terms of space than maybe a small Nyana street in Orlando East or Orlando West. Now, what does that suggest? It suggests that there's already a limit to the type of economic activity that can happen there. And a lot of people are talking about the township economy, but my concern with that is that we're not talking about what are the constraints to having a vibrant township economy. So let me make just a very simple example. In many parts of our continent, you have what is called sidewalk commerce. So because the roadways are quite wide, you have a combination of residential and commercial activity existing uneasily alongside itself. You don't have that in South Africa because the design of our spaces one entry, one exit type township, very small streets. And therefore, on that basis, and then the other element to it, of course, which I can't forget, is that the zoning of that land is only residential. So that allows me to be able, in the same neighborhood, to have a commercial and a residential element. But if you go to the suburbs, there's a home industry, which is coexisting alongside a residential area. And we don't see that as something that's arbitrary. And I think for me, Sarah, it's starting at the level of the home. It's then going to the level of production. But it's also then recognizing that at all of these stages, there are contests. In the home, there's a contest between me as a male and how much care responsibilities that I have and the implications those have for my participation in the labor market. Beyond the home, there's a contest on what is produced and what is consumed and the terms on which we get that. And I think all of these things are ensconced in one structural space that continues to really make it difficult for us to do things beyond just going to sleep and waking up and going to work every day in townships and in rural areas. And I think I argue in the book that that's why this economy is going to misfire. We could have the best commodity prices, we could have the best fundamentals, but at the end of the day, this economy is still going to misfire because the overwhelming majority of people have been closed out of particular forms of economic participation.
And I agree with you with that point. And I think one recent example I can cite are the looting incidents that took place in KZN and Gauteng, where there literally was a time when nobody knew where to go buy bread because bread had to come from literally 100 kilometers away. And I saw something where it really broke my heart, I think, to say where Shoprite was bringing in containers for a time being because we had looted malls, we had looted local shops, we had looted USAVE and all those kinds of things. And then they spiritedly came up with a solution that still did not include us as the people in that environment, because I think that would have been the best time to say, why don't we go to Mams Banbali to bake bread? But no, they decided that, we're going to bring in those containers that might probably stay forever, which it continues as it continues to have an effect on the type of how our townships look, buying in a container and what that means. And an example that I just want to mention with buying in the container thing, I remember when I was still at National Treasury, we were doing site visits to schools and we'd gone to Tsakani. And when we got to Tsakani, the parents were refusing the school because the schools were made out of something similar. So it was called alternative building technology, and the parents were like, because this for us symbolizes poverty. But we're back there right now. Our parents are buying from USAVEs as a container because we don't own. We are back live. We sincerely apologize for that disruption. It's an unanticipated problem with internet connectivity. So we will just continue with our discussion and we apologize once again for this inconvenience. Ayabonga, I don't know if you'll be able to pick up from where you left off. But anyway, as we're having a discussion offline about how our townships are actually not designed to have cars in, I was actually thinking about how sometimes we think it's lawlessness with taxis literally stopping in the middle of the road or whatever, but it's actually because there's never been a design that will accommodate taxis to stop on the side of the road for people to either get on or get off. And the same is done even with us people that own cars now, that if your mother's pavement has a grass, that you're not going to park on it, you have to park on the road, and then it means that the other car is not going to be able to pass. So maybe sometimes it's not an issue of lawlessness or being considerate, but it's because of the spaces that we find ourselves in that were not designed to accommodate us, and perhaps whatever accumulation that would then be able to achieve as we have more access to retail credit. I don't want to say the economy, but yeah, retail credit. And on the matter of retail credit, another thing that I noticed, which also had been gutted in Diplov Square in Soweto, when it started out, so what they had was they had banks, so normal Standard Bank and ABSA or whatever, but they didn't do normal retail banking where you go open a bank account. Largely the services that they had, they were for loans. And I found that quite unfortunate, that why do they think that in townships, the only kind of service that people are going to need from a bank is loans and not necessarily to open a bank account or whatever it is, So,
I think, Sarah, the two issues you raised, the one with the banking model, and maybe I'll come back to that, but I want to come back to your first point around the consumption basket of Africans post-apartheid has not, or I guess has outstripped their spatial environment. So you mentioned this story of, a vehicle. You can't, if you want to park and go inside, you can't avoid parking on the roadway. And a big part of that certainly has to do with this dormitory style township. So this idea that the township is just, it's not even a place for leisure. I mean, outside of a beer hall, maybe. Their design was that you go there to wake up in the morning, go to work, come back in the evening and sleep. Because remember, you are not a South African citizen. And this idea now of citizenship and consumption arises because we came from a system, and we sometimes don't accept this. We came from a system that, in many ways, if I can put it this way, was, it was a system that determined who you could sleep with, what you could eat, where you could live, and so many other things. And I think we're still reeling from that particular system now in ways that we sometimes don't want to think about. Just on the issue of credit, I mean, I find it very interesting that we have such easy access to consumption credit. So, and that's why I titled the article, Room Dividers, Wall Units, and the like, because that was my first experience of credit. But I've also learned that credit has been a way to save South African capitalism from a crisis of demand. So the nature of our economy has been to grow on the basis of cheap energy and cheap labor. But cheap labor means you don't have enough money to buy some of these things straight up. And the mechanism that then assists people to be able to buy the inventory that a Lewis produces is credit. And that's why I then argue entities like that are a very sophisticated loans business where furniture is the mechanism. So the primary thing that is being sold to you is the loan rather than the inventory or the product itself. And I think for me, this example you're making of that F&B, people's performance, I mean, ask anybody who works in a bank, your performance is related to meeting target on what you sell. And in many cases, what you're selling are actually loans, in some cases, to people who can't even afford it.
Can I?
Before you come in, Basani, I just want to pose one question from Zoom, and it's from Marcella David Dukovo. Marcella is asking what template or blueprint, whether it's continental or global, should South African townships follow in order to successfully reimagine and reinvent themselves? I'd actually like that to pose it to the both of you.
Maybe Basani, do you want to start?
No,
What a difficult question.
I mean, I do think in the book, Ayabonga raises the level of investment that would have to take place within the township economy or within the reserve, right? Whether it's the dairy produce, whether it's localizing the value chain, right? So that we are not getting our stuff outside of a 100-kilometer radius, but like there is some level of self-sufficiency. So I would say that the same kind of policies that were implemented nationally within a particular space to industrialize, in other terms, to do some kind of import replacement that would ensure that there is localization of that value chain, right? That can be done in the reserves, right? And he points to growth poles, that whole growth pole kind of policy, a decentralized policy that actually works for us rather than against us, right? Certainly that is done in China. You know, there are cities that are like erected in the space of like, I don't know, like 2 minutes, right? Where you have these zones that where there's a lot of incentives, there's a lot of capital that's put and are designed in a way that you have workers living in that space. So it's like a mixed income type of housing that happens, as well as production sites there, right? I was doing a tour of these sites, right? And you see it, right? There's a factory at the bottom, and at the top, that's where the workers live, I mean, we can also comment on whether or not we want to do that, right? Like that close. I mean, like, do we want to be in the shop floor? Like, do we want the economy that close to our doorstep, right? but certainly, and do we want it that sterile as China? Where are the sports fields? Where are the various things, right? But the question, so yeah, has it happened? Yes, it has. But the question is the financing to get it to happen. And this is the issue that the book contends with, right? Is that there was a consumer boycott that happened in 85 in Lungisi. That happened with an investor boycott internationally, right? Because there was disinvestment then. People were leaving our stock exchange. That continued post-apartheid, this investment boycott, right? And so that's the gap that we are facing. China has managed it, but this is what we are facing in getting the things done.
Yeah.
Before you come in,
Sure.
I also just want you to think about what I think I would call the shame that comes with working in townships, because for the most times, and owing to how it's been structured, where you had to get into a taxi and go work very far from where you stay in order to be seen as a person who's being productive. How do we then remove the shame of now being a person who's a because I think there's a lot of shame that also comes with that, or you're not seen as quite successful, that why we have been when other people actually used to drive to work.
Yeah.
So in reinventing and perhaps revitalizing our townships and wanting to work where we live, how do you also remove the shame from it? Because I really do think that it did to a point perhaps get to where a person's productivity was seen by them waking up and leaving the township and going to work elsewhere and actually coming back.
You know, the question that you're asking and the question that the colleague on Zoom was asking, in many ways, the question I asked as I was writing the book. And that's why the first part of the book is around confronting and overcoming the native reserve. Because I argue that the native reserve is not just the homeland, it's also the township. You go to Tanzania, Kutwa, NU 13, native unit, Kapa, native yard. And it's exactly the same as the native reserves, which were seen as the homelands. And I think the starting point in that for me is a mental issue, to come to your point, Sarah. You know, Mzwake Mbuli says, ukulimala kwengqondo, ukulimala kwesapho, ukulimala kwesapho, ukulimala komphakathi, ukulimala komphakathi, ukulimala kwesizwe. And a big part of overcoming and confronting the native reserve is to also recognize that this is a struggle against ourselves, against what we've been brought up and taught to believe, that upward social mobility means leaving the township every morning and coming back every evening. And throughout the course of your life, living in a township, but not spending a considerable amount of time there. And that is what success looks like. And we have to, in a way, subvert that. Similarly, for many people who come from the rural areas, you've got to subvert that in your own mind first, before we get into the technical things that we can do. Now, on the technical end, I don't have a blueprint, but what I propose in the book from my own observation are a few things we can do. And I want to make one example, Sarah, on food. You know, in the Eastern Cape, the majority of households are reliant on social grants. So the Eastern Cape, the biggest grants, just because of the nature of the households, are child grants and old age grants. Because as I say in the book, the Eastern Cape, in the main, is a place with very old people and very young people, because the working age population is left. Now, there's a big question mark of, we spend all of this money every month. Where is this money spent? Right, it comes from the fiscus, we give it to the household, and then we think our job is done. And I argue in the book that what we should be doing in thinking about how we phase in, for instance, a basic income grant, what are some of the other components of that grant that can subvert the dominance of the mainstream food system? You go to, places like, Mount Elif. I'll just make a typical example. 20 years ago, you had probably more people producing livestock and grains for their own consumption than what you have now. Because now there's centralized distribution chains where the food comes from Durban, maybe, goes straight to a Shoprite, come month end, the mean is a pay, all of us are buying that food. Spilenge, IQF, 2 kg, frozen portions. When ideally we have enough space to be able to be rearing our own chickens and that kind of thing. And I say the one incentive to do that, create a cashless component to the grant. So if the grant is 350 Rand and you want to increase it by 150, make sure that 150, there are conditionalities to how that money is spent. Now, I'm not saying that we must be paternalistic and impose on people what they must eat. But what we're suggesting is that that is a stimulus to those people as producers. They are not only recipients of welfare, they are also producers. And the issue at the moment is that their production goes to waste, or their production is, marginal and in many cases inefficient because there's no capital investment. But no one's going to invest capital there if there's no offtake. And your biggest offtake are the 18.1 million grants that you're paying every month. And for me, I argue that that's the starting point. That if we have a food garden at the back of a church or a food garden in a school that is producing on a necessary scale, if there is surplus beyond what the households where those children come from need, that surplus has to be taken to a market. And in that case, the government must play a role of buyer of last resort for that stuff. Before you even plant a seed in agriculture, you need to know who you're going to sell the stuff to. And we need government to come in and be the buyer of last resort. It might be a prison garden, for example, because that will incentivize higher levels of production. It will incentivize higher levels of localized employment and effectively deal with food insecurity at a household level. The Eastern Cape is a typical example of this. Majority of households in the rural parts of the Eastern Cape are engaged in livestock production. Might be sheep, might be cattle, might be, any small livestock. Yet, come month end, those are some of the most food insecure households. Now that's a contradiction in terms, because what it's suggesting is that that production or livestock rearing is not happening at a scale necessary to meet the food needs of some of the households that might not be producing as much. And I argue that one of the levers we have at our disposal without running the risk of inventing something new, let's look at these grants and be able, based on that, say a component of this, and it's not only food, it might even be things we need day to day, seeds, day-old chicks, paraffin, or any of these things. I'm just making examples of things that would be in the food basket that grant is spent on. And I argue that the other element of it is, there are many cards with SASSA. There's the All Pay, there's, people use their bank cards in some cases, and there's the SASSA card. What do we do with the insight about where those people are spending that money? Do we know how much of that money is being spent at Shoprite? Do we know how much of that money is being spent at specific retailers? Enough for us to bargain with them, because I argue that we're giving them free cash flow every month. If you're spending 18.1 million grants and those grants are being paid out at Shoprite, you can guess where that money is going to be spent. And Shoprite already can fold their arms the whole month and not even plan and say, we know if the pay is happening on the 3rd to the 6th, the 3rd to the 6th is a bumper period for us. And I'm saying, as a state, there's a responsibility on us to intervene to make sure that we create markets. It's not just only about resolving market failures, trying to make sure that markets are more equitable. No, the responsibility at a local level is also about creating markets where markets didn't exist before.
And speaking on the social grant matter, there often is a sentiment of sorts which is quite classist from people that are not recipients, in that people that receive grants are lazy and they're used to receiving free things from the government, etc., etc., etc. And that's one of the discouragement or the voice of dissent when it comes to the basic income grant. But it's untrue, because I think a year ago or so, there actually was an article that came out that showed that there are grant recipients that actually stretch their money. So instead of taking that money to go spend and buy food with the whole 350, for example, if it's 350, there's a Sarah or a Suela that takes 100 Rand and goes buy sweets and sells the sweets in the community that they exist in, so that there's more money that they get out of it and not solely just dependent. So other people actually treat their grant money as some form of as seed money, yes, some form of capital injection to have themselves whatever it is, to sell whatever it is that they want to sell in order to make the money stretch. And now imagine if you have a Sarah that takes 100 Rand and goes buys a case of food grain, and now there are other grant recipients that also come in to buy from me. The money circulates a lot, and it does also dispel this silly sentiment that people have that grant beneficiaries are lazy and they do not want to work and they do not want to pay. I pretty sure believe that if you were to now come up with a sort of like framework and say, this is how we think you now need to do it. You know, because there's also even a known thing where when it's month end, there's a particular community hall where people sell, people that sell their own things know that that particular day we're going to find pensioners. And there's even a credit system amongst Blacks that is based on trust. So I don't even have to look at your track record or whatever it is. I just need to, it has to be, we are there on this particular day. I want you to give me this. So we can tap into that, like you're saying, we can tap into that and formalize it so much that it actually works for the people and it's not things that are just working in
but you see, Sarah, I actually argue, and I agree 100%. But I'm saying the person who's not using that money as seed money must not feel bad, right?
Yeah.
Because my concern is you can only make that argument that classes people make about welfare broadly, and it's not unique to South Africa. If there is a multiplicity of opportunity, it's like even with the sex work debate. A lot of people, make a moral and a value judgment on sex work on the basis of saying there's a multiplicity of jobs you could be doing. There's so many other ways that you could be surviving. And I think the observed reality in South Africa is that those opportunities are not there. And I think it's wrong for us to argue against a basic income grant on the basis that it displaces jobs, when we know the job creation capability of this economy is not up to scratch. And I think, for me, I argue, for instance, that the critical part of our challenge is a crisis of effective demand. And you need welfare to inject demand at a household level. But my issue is that we then are reckless in where that injection of demand goes. So we're happy for that to underwrite, the fat dividends that shareholders get from the likes of the big retailers, without actually trying to say, actually, this money can also be a critical part of our job strategy. We have a massive challenge in South Africa. Production is capital intensive, I think, as Basani has said. But the nature of our workforce, because of Bantu education, because of a history of colonialism and apartheid, is one that is not suited for the type of jobs that are there. So now, in a way, what you need to be doing is to create massive opportunities of employment, meaningful employment, by the way, for people in the labor market that you have rather than what you wish you had. And I'm quite concerned that we're not trying to localize some of what we could be doing. And I think the food is an example, but I think also for me, residential construction is another. I mean, the four-roomed house turns 70 this year. Used to be called a non-European 51-9 or whatever. We still build things that are worse than the four-roomed house. We put it out on tender. Yet you've got multitudes of able-bodied young people in that community that ideally should be getting that opportunity and earning a skill that is transferable and can be used. And we don't do that. Because of the political economy of tenders, you want to make sure your cost base is so low that you're going to end up substituting that young person you could have employed with a machine in order for you to finish the job so that you can cream off the top and be able to get some margin from what you're doing, because you might have to pay people here and there and all of that type of thing. So I think a lot of the issues are, yes, in the private sector market, but a lot of the issues are also in how we deal with these issues. And as I say, I think sometimes it's along power,
Basani, would you like to come in?
No, I mean, there's this debate that's going on around jobs versus grants, as if it's such a dichotomy. And even the business community, echoing the sentiments of the finance minister, will be saying, no, forget the UBIG, let's focus on jobs, right? Let's ensure that we are employing people instead. Of course, we want to employ people, but that's not the kind of thing that is currently happening. So it's such a disingenuous kind of argument to make, because yes, it makes sense. However, if we have a chronic disinvestment in the economy, how do you, this kind of like exclusion that you're talking about, how are people expected to survive, right? And for me, when you read the stats of 1 in 4 people go hungry, it makes no sense to me if 1 in 4 people go hungry
in a food secure country.
That for them to have a grant, right? It's obvious that they'd want to spend that on food, right? So it's actually quite senseless. it's a disingenuous kind of debate, right? And I think what is most heartbreaking for me is that that sentiment is said a month after food riots or an uprising. Like, how can we be that forgettable? Like, how can we it boggles the mind, but that's how the capitalist system works, right? And functions. So yeah, I just find it a very disingenuous argument. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if there are any questions from people who are here. Any questions, comments?
But I wonder how that in the kind of setup that we have, where, for example, Shoprite is a listed entity, how does then government push those companies to say, you've got a secure amount that's coming in? There should be some sort of way that these individuals, or maybe you give back to some degree beyond just a CSR that you do on a yearly basis, then the normal CSR and stuff like that.
Okay, I'm going to have a few questions and concerns. What I do like is your book is very important. The mere fact that the economy of your at my doorstep specifically states that somehow I need to tie myself to the economy. And within the South African context, individuals, normal South Africans are distant from the economy, right? We don't have a relationship with the economy. We don't have understanding of the economy. I mean, essentially, that is why we are not even part of it. So I think that's an important point to it, to say normal individuals, working class, higher income need to be involved together in the economy because we are all distanced from it. But I think I had a few questions about, and I've always had this question about the role of the government, which is very worrying in the context of this, because my question is, I don't think we're overstating the role of the government. What the government is supposed to do, what the expectations we have of government are true. But in the context of what we have seen happening in our years of government, is they have not been fulfilling those roles, right? More specifically in terms of when you were why have they not seen the value of redirecting the funds that are coming in from the grant to say, here is a prerequisite. You're getting Shoprite, this is the money that is being spent, but this is how you need to feed back into society, right? That is possibly a thought process somewhere, but it has not been implemented, it has not been a policy that is being driven. Why? And we keep stating continuously that the government should be doing this, but the government isn't doing that. So now that we know that the government isn't fulfilling their role in economics and developing people in the country, then where do we go after that? What is the solution? What is the driving solution after being failed by government? Government does not work. Our government specifically does not work. The other question I had was when you said we want to employ people. And my question is, who wants to employ people? Basani, you mentioned that in the capitalist society that we have right now, there's no longer capacity to employ, right? Because the resources that they need now are already there. And the conversation is, well, yes, there's more resources out there. So if you were to leave your job, then you would obviously be replaced by someone who needed you now. But it doesn't mean we need someone now, because those roles are already filled. And the roles that we possibly need to be filled don't have the skill that are required. So who wants to employ? Because the government can't employ because they can't afford to employ. And private entities really want to, right now, at a pick and choose, which is exactly how capitalism works. So who wants to employ? Who wants to create these jobs? Because small to medium enterprises try, but they don't have the funds to employ. So when the concept of employment is very difficult to me because I want to understand what it means and who's creating this info. How does it work? Fundamentally, for a person who needs to understand when we say we need to create employment, how are we doing this? What are we doing? Because then we're not depending on the government because they can't, and we can't depend on private because actually they don't have to. They don't need it. The question about sorry, it was Sarah who mentioned about about grants and saying in that study, and I remember actually that article. I remember seeing it possibly on Instagram, and I think the point that comes from me to that is how indignifying poverty is, because you even have to justify how you're using 350, right? Which is tragic, because even if I was using that money for absolutely nothing that matters, it is money that was given to me to use, right? And fundamentally, that is the problem that we have in the country, is that we don't care about people, and our economics doesn't care about people. But I think we know that because that's how societies work. We're at the forefront of creating money and generating money, and that is how the large corporates kind of in the system works. But also in the conversation of creating households that are able to become self-sufficient, to be able to create their own food basket, we need to go back to tying the psychology to the economics of people. To say, I personally, because I said this during the riots, when people are rioting because they're hungry. People are rioting, and I was like, we always separate ourselves from the statistics, especially because you're a working class and you work for a corporate, you have a decent job and you live in a 10-square apartment. You're separating yourself from the economics. And you always say people are rioting because they're hungry, right? But should the money that you're taking away from you, this is something people are always saying, you would also be one of those people that are rioting, right? So individually, we do not have confidence. As an individual, do I think I have the confidence to walk out of there and possibly create a food basket that becomes self-sufficient for me? Do I have confidence? Do I have agency? Do I think I can walk up to individuals who are part of the ruling party and say, hey, listen, these are the problems that are happening in my community, and these are things I want to voice out. And do I think those people will listen to me? Do I think I have agency in my country? And fundamentally, those are the things, because people are not going to initiate anything if they don't even think they are important, if they don't think they matter. And we always separate economics from psychology and emotions, but essentially that is part of developing economics. But people can feel that they matter in the country because that's the only reason why you would want to do something, why you would feel like you are important, that you matter, that you have the capability to do something. Because when you wake up in the morning and you are in a social and you have 300, why in the environment you live in looks the way it looks? What gives you that idea? What is it that makes you feel like you can walk out of there, create this food basket, create this value chain, and be part of this community, the society that is moving? Okay.
We can speak all those fundamentals and all those kind of things. But if you are not going to have access to land, the economy will never work. And we are overpopulated in Gauteng. All of us are in Gauteng. We are not speaking about developing where we come from. I'm from Limpopo. People who are here, they are building their own homes, beautiful homes in Limpopo because of the land which they have. So if we develop Limpopo, our government was going to spend less in building RDPs here in Gauteng because we are all here in Gauteng. So I think if we started speaking about the land, then our issues will be solved. Yes.
Thank you.
So I think the question that Cape Town is raising around land and migrants is very important, because I don't think any of the things that we're talking about are possible outside of a more equitable distribution of productive land. One of the things apartheid did was to place us on some of the most unproductive land, and 13% of it. So I do think that that is very important. But I want to marry that comment to something Nondyebo was raising around this economy not being, or us being excluded from this economy. I hold a bit of a different view. I think the issue is around the terms of our incorporation into that economy. I think we are incorporated into that economy only as cheap labor, and in some contexts, if we can't be exploited as cheap labor, we are incorporated as the mass of the unemployed that is sitting on the margins of that economy. And as consumers, and that's what I argue in the book. So I think the issue is around adverse incorporation, but I think, Nondyebo, you raise a very important issue around the psychology, and that's why I made that point of Zwakhe Mvuli's poem, because I do think that one of the things we haven't been able to balance in the post-apartheid period is to take the best of that culture of self-reliance that was built in the 70s and in very few homeland experiences, where people have power over what they produce. And when I say power over what you produce, I mean power over your children as much as power you have over production. And what we've done in post-1994 is to create a situation where, in our pursuit of the welfare state, we've prioritized transfers from the center, national government, to the core, without giving people the tools that allow them to live their lives. And that's why I like the SASSA example, because what it does is it changes the terms of the balance of power between me as a household reliant on a grant vis-a-vis the government. So I'm no longer now a recipient from the government, but I'm also now a client of the government, because I'm selling my production to the government as a buyer of the last resort. Now, that's one way to think about it. But the other way to think about it, to your question of who is employing, I'm reading some work now which is challenging my thinking even of this idea of what is work. Because my view is that we've got a lot of work to do in our communities, but people are unemployed. Now, what that suggests is that the necessary work, the socially necessary work, is not always the economic work. And the reality is that there are lots of work that are happening at a community level that are not remunerated. We talk about care work, but I would argue there are many other forms of social identity forming type work that is never taken into account or even packaged in a nice EPWP or CWP and given expression. And I think we need to change our definition of work and marry it to need. So necessity and need must determine the type of work that ends up being done at a community level. If the issue, for instance, in our community is that we need to collectivize care responsibilities to free up time for young women that ordinarily should be going into the labor market to search for work, we have enough people that can do that work. Why is that work not being remunerated or recognized as work? And I think for me, that's where the problem starts to happen. I don't think we're going to go back to the industrial type of work, where everybody's working in a factory, spending their time there 9 to 5. That day is gone. But the type of work that we need, even poorer countries than South Africa have more economic and labor market participation than South Africa. And you ask why? And the reason for that is because there's a large informal sector, there's a large non-capitalist agricultural sector that absorbs many people into meaningful work in a way that contributes to their livelihoods. And in South Africa, apartheid decimated both of those. To this day, we still hound people for selling intloko in the inner city because it doesn't fit the mold of a nice city. And I mentioned Herman Mashaba's case in the book. I mean, I think in the general state of lawlessness in the CBD, to go and fetch a guy who is selling a cow's head, dripping with blood in the city, is very problematic. When, the situation in our economy is one where you should be having, when people lose their jobs, a vibrant informal sector that can absorb them for those moments of unemployment. We don't have that in South Africa. Even if you go to places like the Eastern Cape, you find Omama bathenga spinach on the side of the road, and you ask, where are you sourcing your stuff? I buy it at Boxer. So there's value chain problems even in the informal sector. When we say people must go and hustle in the informal sector, they must hustle. Where must they get their inventory? If they're getting it from the same mainstream value chains. And I think for me, subverting and confronting the native reserve is also a task in subverting and confronting dominant economic power in the society. Because only then can we build self-reliant forms of actualizing. And actualizing doesn't only look like me going in a Kika and Boboza to catch a taxi to go to town. I can actualize by actually doing very socially necessary and effective work in my community that gives me meaning, but also make sure that I don't starve. I don't know, there was the other question, sorry, that my brother was asking, just to conclude, on these are big entities, how do we hold them to account? And I think we've got a lot of instruments and leverage points, and we sometimes don't use them. So the grant is one typical example of that. Now, if you look at some of the retailers, some of them are BEE level 7. Now, what does that say? It means you are at probably the lowest levels of BEE, but every month you're benefiting from state spending. The state might not necessarily have to give you a license, but effectively the state's activities are giving you a windfall every month. And there should be some relationship of reciprocity there. And one of those examples is if I am in Bembe, in Limpopo, you might find, for instance, that there's fruit from Bembe that is in the value chain of some of the big retailers. But that fruit makes a very inefficient trip to a distribution center to come back again to Bembe to be sold there. And that's unnecessary. If we were able to collectivize that at a local level and be able to create alternative economies that arise from it. And my concern is that the formal sector and the informal sector, when it comes to food, are reliant on the same value chain. All of them get the things from the Joburg market, or all of them get it from the same places. And that is suggesting to me that that is happening at a time when people are growing yellow maize that goes to waste because they don't have places to harvest it or to store it and that kind of thing.
Yeah, your provocations were deep, very, very deep. Because what you're saying is that it seems tautological to talk about, look, we have this issue, right, in which we are seeing this high levels of unemployment and we're just seeing people being excluded. And I agree with Aya that they are incorporated into the economy in a particular way. So we are all part of it, but are incorporated in a particular way. And there's just no care. And then you spoke about like the state is meant to do something about this. So it seems tautological to come up with policy proposals if the ones as a response, when the question is the question of governance, right? And it's a question of accountability, right? Which I think that needs deep exploration in terms of how do we keep people accountable? Like what level, what kind of organizing is required, right? Certainly for the middle classes, you enter politics. Well, we are always engaged in politics, but the level of organizing, of doing something with your local councillor, that kind of thing happens in some reserves, in some townships. But then for most of us, it's every 4 years or when there's a local government, and then we are on the Twitter. So how, like, what kind of social organizing is required? Is it at the level of state, or should we think about governance differently? Not the centralized thing, but at the local, because some of the issues that Uaya is talking about are local, right? So what does that mean? What is your relationship to the local in terms of how we think about governance, right? I mean, the legislation, there's certain loopholes now that open up the space for, I think, please correct me, because you both of you know more, but basically, you can go into parliament, like if there's, isn't it some kind of legislation that allows for contestation. No, okay, I'm blurring my. I shouldn't go into that too far. But I think this is the question. It's around. There are all these ideas which Aya has, right? But what kind of, sorry, that's the mic. What kind of governance structure, how must we think of ourselves not as only economic agents within the space, but also as political ones that are constantly engaged, right? And so what has happened is that there's a professionalization of politics, right? And that's the level of alienation that there is. If there is a fire, you call the fireman. You don't think to do something about it. And there's fear too, because you're not the profession. You're not in the profession. A similar thing happens in the realm of politics, right? So there's another book, Aya, that I believe is required here around what kind of organizing is required to make this a reality, because that is the question I think you're asking. Another thing, which I had a whole thing prepared, but I'll say it very briefly, is that I don't think that what these retailers are after is just using credit for credit's sake, right? And then earning from that. The financialization concept that you bring in, which we haven't really gone into, is that they are using, I mean, the Lewis example is that they are luring people through credit, right? And credit is used as a stopgap, right? But the financialization part is how they can then repackage that and on-sell that as a way of making more money, and how that is so we have become an asset class, right? And you speak about it, Aya, briefly around, you get credit at Lewis, and then there's an insurance product that you are sold, right? That you have to, whatever. And then that insurance becomes like an investment vehicle. There is more, I think, that needs to be explored there as to how that money is like what happens to the repackaging. But there's also more that has to be explored around the debtors book, right? Which I don't think is explored here, right? So we are creditors, they have a debtors book. What is happening? That in itself is an asset class that can be repackaged, and resold, and resold, and resold, and blended with mortgages and resold. That's the money. That is the money.
That's what led to the global financial
crisis.
That's
what led to the global financial crisis, right? And that's part of. And as I was doing the preparing my notes, what I came across is the fact that in 2015. The Lewis group was taken to the NCR, whatever it's called, because they started selling credit. I mean, they started luring people into like giving credit, but then getting people into the insurance thing, selling them insurance on top of the credit that were self-employed and that were pensioners. Now, this is predatory, right? For you to get to that level of predatory, you can't look at credit as credit per se, but you need to look at it as an asset class that is repackaged because they are making a lot of money. And when we look at the global financial crisis, that is exactly what happened. We sold mortgages to the unemployed, right? And there's this, Minsky, that whole thing. So I think there's a lot here that the book kind of like opens us to. And the issue is that when you try, because I try to look at the financial statements and trying to figure out where's the debt, and I'm not a finance major in that sense, but the issue then is a lot of the stuff is hidden. how do we get to that, to understand the drive towards this credit? Because it's a serious drive, it's predatory. The only reason why we are, so the financialization, there's the intensiveness of it, and what Aya is talking about is how extensive it is. So how it moves from the realm of just financializing cars and whatever to now the household. But there is a barrier in which we can get to that level, and that's through credit regulations and whatever. But these things are under contestation, right? Like there is activity around, for instance, ensuring that the pension ceiling, right, is increased so that we can use that money for corporates to invest. These are issues that are maybe in the financial mail, in the business day, but are not part of our day-to-day. This is how we are incorporated. So we are not excluded. This stuff is happening. And thank you, Aya, for really using this book as a way of exploring this. But I think there's more to be said about that kind of.
Can I just say something just on this contestation? Because to Nondia's comment, I think even when we think about the role of the state is contested within the state. There are departments within the state that hold a different view to other departments around what the state ideally should be doing. So it's not a homogeneous space. There's contestation, there's fights there. You know, and I think the other comment I try and make in the book is that financialization, and this might seem self-evident, but it's also financialized the banks, right? So in economics 1, we're taught that a bank's job is to make sure that industry is able to function. But what I argue in the book is that banks now have become financialized vehicles themselves. And a typical example of that is, why is it that I have to pay for printing out a letter that says I have a bank account with a certain bank? Now that's a fee, right?
Yeah.
Now, what the banks are trying to do is to shift away from a branch model, which gives them a fixed amount of fees. So the fees there are deposit fees, it's fees for withdrawing money, that's it. But if now I take you to the app as a place to verify your transactions, I can charge you for activity on the app. I can get your data about where you're spending that and sell it to somebody else. And then in addition to that, I can also make money off of you and some of the needs that you might have. And that's why you're seeing a lot of banks become ICT players now. Banks are selling airtime and making margin and money off of that, rather than becoming people that fund industry. And I argue in the book that South African banks in particular make a considerable amount of money, close to 50% in many instances, from non-lending activities. So they're not borrowing anybody money, but they're making money off of fees for opening your account, fees for sending you a letter. And you then get shocked that small businesses and even large businesses are saying, we can't get funding. I mean, I speak about, one of the dairies in the Eastern Cape. I mean, one CEO, and I won't mention who, in the Eastern Cape says to me, we battle to even have credit lines. And we're a massive manufacturer. We even export, but we battle to get credit lines with the mainstream banks. Because banks, by their nature, have ceased to be entities that are about lending. And that's why the credit guarantee scheme, for instance, bombed out. Because banks, by their nature, are not used to lending money to small businesses. They create all of these mechanisms to make sure that it's the most riskless thing for them to do. Because their real money actually doesn't come from the interest spread. So the spread between what they lend and what maybe they might be paying over to you as somebody who puts the deposits in the bank.
Thank you. I'm tempted to just present one last question, which I think is very interesting. And with that, I'd then like for your closing remarks in answering the question. So it's from someone who's anonymous attendee. Quite interesting. And the question is on chronic disinvestment in our economy. So this person would like to know what are some of the driving factors for this chronic disinvestment behavior. And they want to know as well if it's by both government and the private sector, or it's skewed in one direction and not the other.
Why do they?
That's why
are they anonymous? I mean, this is very interesting. Look, I think, and Basani touched on this. One of the implications of financialization is that it takes money away, the opportunity cost of money, takes money away from productive investment. So I ask a question at the end of the book. How many of us in this room have pensions? I would argue quite a few more, maybe. You know, you put your money away, your employer might. Now, how many of us who do have pensions have experienced some of that money that is pooled being invested in areas that employ people we know? Then the question becomes a bit, we're not sure, right? Biggest investor in the African economy, not in the South African economy, the African economy, is a pension fund of government employees of South Africa. But you have government employees in South Africa who are living in backyards, who can't afford a bond. Now that's a contradiction. My capital is being used to go and prop up a Steinhoff, but I can't even afford to have shelter over my head. And that's only possible because we've created a disconnection between the real economy and pooled savings of capital, be it for insurance or investment purposes. Marxists say now the real intention of money is to create more money rather than to create more economic activity. And I think capitalism has reached a stage, and I say this in the book, where it no longer needs warm human bodies to accumulate more. The scandal of the early 20th century in South Africa was, how do you get African people off of the land and into the factory and the farm to expand capital, right? The crisis of now is that capital can accumulate, as I was saying with the banks, without the need for people, I'm gonna SKL, a teller there sending you something. We don't need that anymore. And I think for me, that's what makes a basic income grant something that we need. Because we can't assume that the jobs are there. Because the nature of the capitalist accumulation path is such that it no longer needs labor in order to expand and to become profitable. And I think for me, that presents a problem for investment. Because people invest on the basis of expectations of profitability. But you can't have a profitable economy in South Africa when the majority of people don't have money to spend. We talk about savings. Yeah, South Africa has a low savings rate. Well, you can only save something that is surplus to your needs. If I'm living in a multi-generational household, there's about 8 of us in this home, I'm working around the minimum wage, what am I going to save?
Closing remarks, Basani?
Yeah, so much to say. So so much to say. But I'm just gonna kind of like piggyback on what I was saying now. Technology is not just a scientific thing. The technology we use is an outcome, I think, of class struggle, right? And in saying that, we are in this kind of trajectory as a result of a particular class struggle as it has unfolded. However, I think that her name, Maggie Jobeka and co demonstrate that such a thing is not, there isn't an inevitability. There are ways. It's just, as you said, there are tools we need to overcome an analysis and more analysis, but also tools we need to overcome. So having said that, I would respectfully disagree that that there is no space for wage employment, because I see it as this outcome, right? And it goes back to Jobega's question on the question of governance, on the question of how we organize ourselves, how we actually ensure that the factories can be there. Because in terms of the UBIG, there is a question of sustaining such a thing. What do we tax? Okay, others say tax the machine, right? But where do we get the revenues to generate, to kind of like sustain this? Like, what's the fiscal implication here, right? And you may have an answer. Yeah, I just I just think for me, this is not an inevitable thing. I believe in a socialist alternative.
In our lifetime. In our lifetime.
I love myself.
In our lifetime. Sorry, Sarah, can I maybe make my closing remarks as a reading from the book? Because I do think a lot of what you've been talking about, as Basani was talking, just crystallizes for me in a passage in the book. So I don't know if you want to pass me your copy. Because I know the other one is, in the mic.
In the mic.
So I'm going to expropriate it just for a second. And what I'm going to read comes from a section in the book that is called Kaundenzundu.
Yes.
And I talk there about, and it comes back to the point that economies really are about people. They're not really about all of the other things that we think they are about. And I'm going to read it. It's on page 158. And it's, that penultimate paragraph in that section. And it reads as follows. All these matters, as we all continue to learn, are linked. Current struggles for housing and sanitation are not unrelated to the civic contests of old. New digital technologies feed old impulses of extraction and market dominance and power, while kerkvergaderings fix the price of milk, bread, and the price of South African currency. Lurking in the shadows is always a force that can break bones and rupture skulls in pursuit of and in defense of property. Rather than braai days, this is our real heritage. As real as a break-in in a residential area, the stun grenades at a community protest, or as real as Marikana. Yet in all of this, we have agency as economic actors, as economic activists, to fight on the shop floor and beyond for better wages and more humane conditions of work, for a shorter work week, for homes close to where we work, for places to shit in, for care when we are ill and old, and for schools for our children. But more importantly, for power over what we produce.
Thank you. So, thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and our most sincere apologies once again for starting late, as well as for the disruptions that we experienced throughout the launch. Thank you very much. So a copy goes for $270 here at Book Stokvel Capital. You can also get it from other shops you don't like buying from.
Get a chair.
Yeah, please come to Melville. The local. Also, they have an online store, by the way. So even if you're in Cape Town or wherever, you can just order and they'll deliver to you. So you don't have to go to, anyway. Thank you very much. And I hope you'll be joining us for other launches with other organizations. Thank you. May it be a good evening.
And that's a wrap.
Well done. Yo, guys.
Yeah, man.